improve fish and wildlife habitat, excuse me, and the quality of life for all those who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas River Basin. The Clackamas River Basin Council invites applicants interested in joining our staff to protect water quality, improve fish and wildlife habitat, and the quality of, whoops, hold on there a minute, please. I just, so, yeah, sometimes high technology has got to, isn't as cracked up as it says it is. So on behalf of the Basin Council, I'd like to thank our two gold sponsors tonight, the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas River Environment Services. And Gail, I think you're going to skip that video tonight, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So we also like to thank our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers, the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, of whom we've got a participant or two joining us tonight, Port Blakely and Metro. So thanks also to the many individuals who have also donated to support the conference. And we continue to seek additional donations, which are tax deductible. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It's originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples, and is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. We're gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn some in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. So the CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College, and workshop attendees will receive a signed certificate of completion for each session. If you'd like a certificate of completion, add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conferencing Networking Google Sheet and indicate you'd like a certificate in the G column, and we'll forward your contact information to Clackamas Community College. So before we get started, I'd like to share a few ground rules. So please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate. And you can keep your cameras off if you like. So we're going to be mixing it up here a little bit tonight. We have one presenter who will present first, who will then have to leave after his presentation due to another commitment, but we'll open the questions up after he first gives his presentation. And then after that Q&A, then we'll launch into the second presentation. And after that presentation, we'll have a second round of Q&A. So please keep your video cameras off, and that'll help us save bandwidth for our presenters and greatly reduce the carbon footprint for our meeting. So we'll have 3 presenters this evening with a brief Q&A as I discussed. So please type your questions in the chat and we'll select questions from there. And feel free to send direct chats to friends you're seeing in the participants list if you like. So now we'll start our presentation for this evening. So again, please remember to type your questions in the chat unless there's some burning concept that you have to have explained during the presentation. And please keep yourself muted and we'll answer questions at the end of each speaker's presentation. The webinar will extend to about 7:15. And our presenters tonight, our first will be Mr. Michael Hayworth, who is the Assistant District Fish Biologist for the North Willamette District of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Previously, he has worked on a number of projects throughout the Lower Columbia, including conducting spawning ground and habitat surveys, Clackamas and Sandy broodstock collection, operating weirs and screw traps, and the chum reintroduction project. He received his BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Science from Oregon State and has been an avid angler ever since he can remember. And Riz Bradshaw is currently serving on our CRBC Board of Directors as well. Was raised in Oregon City within walking distance of the Willamette River, the Clackamas River, and Abernathy Creek. He began working at Sportcraft Landing at age 14, then employed by Carolina Biological Supply in Gladstone. Riz served 2 terms as Clackamas County Sheriff, who many of you probably will recall, did a fine job. He's lived on the river ever since 1989. And lastly, we have Mr. Forrest Foxworthy, who's a lifelong Oregonian who grew up fishing on the Clackamas River. He's been a fishing guide in the state of Oregon since 1980 and has seen many changes on the Clackamas River in his lifetime. So now let's please welcome Michael, Riz, and Forrest as they present about the anadromous fish, trout, and lamprey species within the Clackamas River Basin. So take it away, Michael, please.
Bear with me 1 second here.
No problem. Just hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Okay, can you see that okay?
Looks beautiful.
Okay, great. That's what I'm going for. Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys. As Dave mentioned, I'm the assistant DB for the North Willamette District. And most of you probably know, but some of you may not, that our district's actually split up between a west side and an east side. And I'm the assistant DB for the east side, which is effectively everything from Salem north to the Columbia, and then everything from the Willamette east to the Cascades. So certainly the Clackamas River falls in there, as well as does the Malala, the Sandy, and a number of other water bodies. So I've been asked today to just kind of give you a brief update as to what we've been seeing primarily in the lower Clackamas, mostly below the falls, in terms of wild anadromous fish. So I'll primarily be talking about wild fish today. I know my boss, the district fish biologist, Ben Walczak's going to be giving you an update about our hatchery programs and some of our hatchery returns in the future. So I'll steer clear from that for today. If you bear with me, I just have a few hundred slides to get through. So just kidding, not really, but I'd like to start with this slide that PGE has so kindly thrown together for us. It's kind of just a great reminder. I'm sure we've all seen it, but a great reminder as to why the Clackamas is unique. You can see we have basically salmon and steelhead in the system year round, basically at every stage in their life history. And in terms of the lower Columbia and even in Oregon, that's pretty fantastic and pretty unique. You can see we're through our spring Chinook season. Those fish have all spawned and by now been, for the most part, washed out in some of our more recent rain events. We're currently past the peak run for our early migrating coho, and one of the reasons the Clackamas is unique in that we also have a late returning wild coho run in the Clackamas that runs and clear into the winter time and almost approaching the spring, which is pretty unique and pretty fantastic. And then finally, winter steelhead are right around the corner. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but rumor has it that PGE's already had a couple wild winter steelhead up to their North Fork Dam. So that's pretty exciting as well. And today I'm primarily going to be talking with you about just that winter steelhead, coho, and fall Chinook. And I'll also be giving you a little bit of a rundown on what's going on with lamprey and kind of a couple other hot button items that I'm sure you're aware of. So before I go into too much detail about what we're seeing for numbers in the lower river, it's kind of good to briefly touch on how we get those numbers. And of course, in terms of above the dam, North Fork Dam, we're fortunate in that we have PGE state-of-the-art facility where we're able to monitor effectively in real time our passage and what fish are migrating upstream and when. And that's certainly convenient and has been really useful. And I will talk about those numbers a little bit today, but primarily, as I mentioned, what I'm talking about are lower river fish. And we are able to get those numbers basically through our monitoring efforts, primarily through spawning ground surveys. And that monitoring effort is basically one of our four legs that supports the foundation that makes up the Oregon Plan. And effectively, the Oregon Plan was established in 1997 by Oregon legislature, and it's our coordinated approach to recover salmonid populations and to restore watersheds to healthy conditions to address issues and requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act, as well as the Endangered Species Act. And it's basically designed to function within our regulatory requirements, our social realities, and our funding constraints. And I'm not really going into those other legs, government agencies, voluntary action, or scientific oversight, but I'll primarily be talking with you about our monitoring efforts, which is how we get our abundance estimates for the lower river. And I mentioned spawning ground surveys. Those are conducted primarily by our OASIS project, which stands for Oregon Adult Salmon Inventorying and Sampling Project. And that's a mouthful, which is why we call it OASIS. But effectively, they are tasked with the role of monitoring the status and trends of naturally produced Oregon coastal and lower Columbia salmonid stocks. And for the most part in Oregon, they target Chinook, chum, and coho September through January, and then steelhead February through about mid-June. And then at that time, while conducting the steelhead spawning ground surveys, they're also looking for Pacific and Brook lamprey. And as Dave mentioned, I spent a number of years conducting those surveys throughout the lower Columbia. I don't know if you can recognize that handsome devil standing in the creek there, but that's actually me. And there'll be some a prize given out to whoever can name what tributary I'm standing in. I'm sure it looks pretty familiar to Dave and most of you, but so just a little bit more terminology before we go into the numbers. The key metrics that OASIS has been looking at is abundance, spatial distribution, temporal distribution, and proportion of hatchery fish and the naturally spawning population. And as I mentioned today, I'm talking mainly about our abundance estimates. And those numbers are broken down into sort of 3 size classes. We'll talk primarily starting at our like an evolutionary significant unit size, which you can see today we're talking about the lower Columbia ESU, and then broken down farther from there. Within that area is the Cascade stratum, which is the Cascade side of that ESU. And then within that stratum, I'll be specifically talking about populations within the Clackamas itself. So being that it's coho season and we're in the middle of a pretty stellar run, I thought I would start here. This is sort of the typical ODFW fish ID slide. I'm sure everybody knows what a coho looks like, but it's kind of a good reminder and a good place to start. This is a bright ocean coho. You can see it's a hatchery fish. It doesn't have its adipose fin. But a lot of times these fish can be confused with fall Chinook or even steelhead. So I just thought it's, a good reminder to look. One of the easiest ways to differentiate between those species is to look at the gum lines primarily, especially with coho. It's going to be dark on the outside and then basically be white right at the base of the teeth. And then also in terms of looking at the difference between coho and steelhead, one of the easiest things to look at is the caudal fin. You can see with the coho, it's deeply V'd or forked, whereas with the steelhead, it's going to be more straight, like almost like a broom. But moving on from there, this graph is our estimated abundance of naturally spawning coho in the Clackamas River. And this is the upper and lower river from 1992 to 2019. And the reason I included the lower river and the upper river for coho is because in 2020 we had some significant issues in our monitoring efforts, primarily due to COVID-related budget constraints. So we had some holes there in our data, but when looking at the overall river since '92, you can see we're definitely on an upward trend. Looking at from 2002 to 2019, for instance, you can see we had an average return of 3,878 fish, a minimum return of 1,300 fish, and then a maximum of a booming maximum of 10,670 fish. So keep that in mind when we look at the next slide. That's certainly an impressive number. As I mentioned, though we don't have that survey data from 2020, we were able to take the adult dam passage counts and use them to sort of extrapolate as to what we're seeing both upstream and downstream. And that's, you can see that in 2020, we just had an actual boomer of a year with the estimated abundance of natural origin fish being at 11,512 fish. So that's super impressive. And definitely something we're excited about. And then, even further, looking at what's going on right now, it's really exciting. You can see already the North Fork adult passage count is at over 9,000 fish. In fact, I think last time I looked, it was closer to 10,000, but it's, it's on the way up. And as I mentioned before, we still have our late returning wild coho to take into account. So certainly exciting to see fish doing so well, especially in the Clackamas, and definitely can equate some of that to maybe coho utilizing different areas in the ocean, despite ocean conditions not being great. But largely there's no denying that it's just the state-of-the-art fish passage facilities at PGE. Their innovative fish passage infrastructure that allows those fish to bypass 3 dams and to quickly access all the incredible habitat upstream. That's just made a huge difference. Again, I'm not trying to steal PGE's thunder, but it's definitely exciting to see these fish doing so well. And not just upstream migrating fish, but also the smolt that are out migrating, and the infrastructure that goes into that. So those are huge improvements that are definitely playing a large role. And it's exciting to have seen such a good year. This is actually a picture of a fish my buddy caught this year. It's been some really nice, beautiful fish on the Clackamas. So I try to throw in as many pictures that I've taken myself for your entertainment here. But moving on from that, is not as encouraging of a topic, but you can see this is the same traditional ODFW fish ID slide. You can see this is a wild fish. It has its adipose fin intact. And while talking about fish ID, you can see the lower jaw is going to be all white inside the mouth. And then again, there's the caudal fin. This picture is not very good because it's actually kind of compressed. So it doesn't really show what I was talking about. But if you were to expand that caudal fin out, you would see it's definitely more straight across and deep feed. That's just sort of a update on some fish ID for you. But overall, wild fish in the lower river have not been doing well. And before I go into those numbers, just wanted to mention that our abundance estimates are actually developed a little bit differently with steelhead, and that we look at red abundance estimates and we convert them to fish abundance using a standard conversion factor. And the reason we do that, there's a couple of reasons. Well, steelhead are incredibly elusive as it is, so they're very difficult to detect in the wild. But also steelhead, they spawn in not just in tributaries, like you'll see primarily coho and tributaries, but winter steelhead certainly utilize those areas too. But they'll be spawning in main stem, so it's much more difficult to see them there. But also they're an idiroparous fish, and so basically what that means is, unlike Chinook or coho, there's a portion of steelhead that don't necessarily die after spawning. So I think in the Clackamas, typically like 7 to 10% of those fish that spawn don't actually die after spawning, which is really incredible, a fascinating part of their life history. But it can also make it difficult when trying to develop estimates, because if fish aren't dying, you can't count dead fish. So that's partly why we've had to develop this other method of using reds to develop our estimates. So with that, the 7-year average was 1,507 fish. And in 2021, we had a return of 328 fish. And just for kind of a reference to show it wasn't just a lower river and upper river problem, I also threw the North Fork dam counts on there too. And they similarly had 1,400 fish, 7-year average, and only about 662 returned. So, excuse me. This graph basically shows our returns since 2011. And it's, for whatever reason, 2021 isn't on here. I apologize, but you can see the number would be way down here. Overall, their returns have been really poor. But that said, it isn't just a Clackamas problem that we're seeing. In fact, in 2021, our total wild winter steelhead red estimates were actually 80% overall of what they were from the prior 7-year average in the lower Columbia River. And I included our recovery plan delisting goal number on there just to kind of give you a reference as to basically what it would look like for if we were to have healthy returns of fish on average for NOAA to ever consider, delisting. Obviously, we'd have to take into account a lot of other things, but basically that number would have to be near the 10,671 mark. And we're consistent. We've been under 2,000 fish now. So with the 328 returning, we're definitely a ways off from that. So it's definitely discouraging. Overall, we think, there's a lot of factors that could be playing into this. Certainly habitat and predation, both in fresh and salt water are a factor. But the reality is we have had really poor ocean conditions. And different salmonids use different areas in the ocean. So for instance, coho might enter saltwater from freshwater and just decide to head straight north. Whereas winter steelhead, they hit saltwater and they head straight west and just cut right out sort of into the heart of the warmest water. So, where these species utilize saltwater is definitely plays a role in how they've been doing. But, there's just a lot of factors to take into consideration. Sort of anecdotal, but an observation some of us made this last year, and I'm sure Forrest and many of you maybe witnessed the same thing, is though our return was really poor, we definitely had, on average with some of those early returning fish, they're very big. That we had a lot of fish that were, approaching the 15-pound size or over, which, for steelhead is really big. So I don't know. It's not by any means a silver lining, but just an interesting observation. I'd be curious if some of you sort of saw or heard that same thing. But moving on into lamprey, which are not eels. Kind of make this slide joking, but also, a lot of people do refer to lamprey as eels, and they're actually not related closely at all. Lamprey are a jawless cartilaginous fish, and they're an incredibly old species. They've actually been on the earth between 400 and 450 million years, which is really fascinating. They've been here long before sturgeon, which is pretty cool to think about. And they have a really interesting life cycle. Their life history is really diverse in that, they can be in their sedentary stage, as you can see here, for 4 to 6 years, lying and waiting and the substrate, which is really cool, before they emerge and migrate out to sea, and then become parasitic and live off of other fish, which is a really cool and unique life history. Being an anadromous fish, that's pretty cool. And it's basically, this is how they've been doing. So in the lower Columbia, this is the Pacific lamprey peak red density and random and supplemental steelhead spawning surveys from 2003 to 2021. And there were years where some populations weren't monitored, so there's definitely some holes in this data, but it gives you a pretty good idea of kind of what we've been seeing. The Clackamas is there is the red bar, which you can see is consistently done fairly well, but just in the lower Columbia River ESU, Pacific lamprey red densities appear to be up from last year, except in the Clatskanie population. And the only populations that were above the 6-year average were in the Scappoose and Clackamas. So it's interesting to see that. These fish are primarily spawning within the lower 10 miles of the mouth of the Clackamas. And I think the main theory as to why that is basically its proximity to the Willamette Falls, the water quality down that low. There's a couple different theories, but for the most part, what we're seeing in the main stem is fish spawning from the mouth to I-205. That section is just just blows up with lamprey. You can see hundreds of fish in there. You can go down to Clackamas and basically see them from the boat ramp there. Even it can be so thick with them that time of the year. But in terms of the tributaries, most of our reds per mile are occurring in Clear Creek and Abernathy as well. And Clear Creek is fascinating in that it's an absolute powerhouse for a lot of our lower river fish. It's just a tributary that's incredibly productive, especially for winter steelhead and coho, but to also be seeing a great deal of lamprey reds in there is pretty cool too. And then Abernathy as well. It has some of the highest densities of any spawning surveys in all of Western Oregon. So it's kind of a sleeper. I think for a while it was maybe not on people's radars in terms of lamprey habitat. So it's cool to see that kind of blow up. And then I really like this picture. It shows the disc mouth when they're at their parasitic adult stage. You can see their 3 teeth, which is one of the easiest ways to ID these Pacific lamprey when they're adults. And that's where they get their species name, which is Tridentata. So you can look at their teeth if you ever want to hold one of these things and look at their teeth. But yeah, so from there, I wanted to briefly discuss Western Brook lamprey because it is something that surveyors are looking for when conducting steelhead surveys and looking for Pacific lamprey. And these fish are not anadromous like their cousins, but they're pretty fascinating nonetheless that they spend their entire lives in freshwater. This species bypasses its juvenile stage and it basically goes from larval directly into being an adult. And they're really small. They're about 7 inches long. And it's really difficult to identify. Basically, if you have a juvenile Pacific lamprey or you have a Western Brook lamprey, they look very similar and it can be difficult to tell the two apart. But they actually, in their larval stage, they're filter feeders, which is pretty cool. They're never parasitic like Pacific lamprey. And effectively, the habitat they utilize is, as larvae, they burrow into soft sediment and slow-moving, relatively freshwater streams. And then as adults, they mature and spawn and die in the same water. And when we look at their limiting factors and threats, they're very similar to Pacific lamprey, if not the same. Artificial barriers, water quality, poor habitat, predation, and of course climate change. We assume they're not doing fantastic, but that said, we don't have a huge amount of data on them, and they're very difficult to monitor, and that they're very small, and the reds they make are, the size of a teacup. They look like an elk's footprint in the substrate, so it's difficult to be able to differentiate. So some of the numbers aren't quite there in terms of monitoring in the lower river. From there, we'll jump into fall Chinook. And again, this is our fish ID slide. You can see this is a wild fall Chinook. It has its adipose. Overall, these are going to be, for the most part, much bigger than the average coho or steelhead. And one of the easiest ways to ID them is by looking at their lower jaw. It's going to be typically all black. There's some other traits there too, but which can vary, but that's going to be one of the tried and true methods for IDing them. And they're not doing great in the Clackamas. You can see our 5-year average was 498 fish with a minimum of 34 fish and a maximum of 880. And in 2020, we had a measly 102 adults in the lower river. And these fish, they're tule stock, so they spawn primarily in the lower river, in the main stem, and usually they're spawning between August and September. So, this day and age, that means low warm water, which makes them, susceptible to disease and predation and everything that comes with low warm water. So that could be one of the main reasons they're not doing well. It's probably a number of factors with habitat and ocean conditions, again, rolling into that. It's always sort of a cocktail of why fish aren't doing well. It's never one thing, but just as a reference, again, I have that recovery plan delisting goal number up there to show you how far off we are from it. It's the 4,359. So you can see at 102 fish, were we ever to consider or hope to delist, we would have quite a long ways to go. And our data is a little spotty. These fish have been kind of overlooked and not monitored as closely for whatever reason, but this data just goes back to 2011. So that kind of brings me to one of my final topics. It's sort of a hot button item, pardon the pun, in terms of as far as what we've seen this year on the Clackamas. We had a pretty gnarly June heat wave, which I'm sure everybody remembers. It was just insanely hot this year. And on the Clackamas in June, we had water temps that were, 69 to over 70 degrees for extended periods of time. I think it was about 5 weeks or so. And not only was it hot during the day and was the water low and we were in a drought stage, but it also was really hot at night. So that water really never had a chance to cool down. And basically what we had was what we refer to as a pre-spawn mortality event on the lower Clackamas. And we had a similar event back in 2015, which some of you might remember. This was not nearly as extreme as that. In 2015, we had over 600 adults die, and this last summer we were under 100 fish, but it still was definitely alarming. You can see in this picture here just how bright some of those spring Chinook were, and just talk about getting kicked when you're down. This looks like a hatchery spring Chinook there that was very bright and never had a chance to really make it far into the system. We were conducting surveys for a couple times a week during that period, mainly counting dead fish and taking biological samples and some measurements to sort of assess what was going on. And fortunately, it didn't last any longer than it did. But it's unfortunate in that it affects these Chinook and Steelhead not just as adults, but the warm water affects them as juveniles that are out migrating or in the system. But not just salmon and steelhead, but the impacts that it has to native fish, kind of other native fish, can often get overlooked. And our salmon runs are important to us, but the Clackamas also has a number of other species in it that were really negatively affected, whether it's whitefish or large-scale suckers or pike minnow or sculpin. Those fish were also dying off and really heavily impacted by these warm water events rather. And so, that's definitely something to take into account because we don't fully really understand how that might impact our ecosystem in the long term or overall. And then also the implications that this has for creating opportunities for invaders, as I've titled it. The Willamette, there's just about every species thriving in the Willamette right now, as we know, whether it's smallmouth bass or a channel catfish. And when this water warms up and continues to warm up, those fish find their way in to the Clackamas, for instance, where there are opportunities to, predate on the native fish in there. So it's sort of a double whammy. Fish getting kicked while they're down. Not only are they negatively impacted physically by the warm water, but also you have to consider effects that other predators might play a role in. And we're seeing. I know that we're talking primarily about the Clackamas, but the Molalla is a great example. This year we had smallmouth bass as far upstream as 10 miles in the Molalla. And we found channel catfish, by the hundreds down in the lower river this year. And, there's been bass in the Malala for some time, but to find them up that high was pretty alarming. And you just think about, what could potentially occur in the Clackamas should we have these warming trends in the future. And so it's definitely something, worth thinking about. And, unfortunately right now we're just dealing with warm water conditions and years with low warm water. And there's not always an immediate fix. And unfortunately, sometimes all we can do, like with this heat wave, is sort of monitor what's going on and assessing the negative impacts that are there. And, just try to be hopeful for the future. But I realize I kind of breezed over that pretty quickly, but appreciate the opportunity. And it's sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, or the good and the ugly and the ugly, depending on how you see it, as to what's going on with wild fish in the lower river. My contact information is here. If you have any questions in the future or want to reach out to me for whatever reason, I encourage you to write that down and to add it to your contacts, and we can be in touch.
Thank you, Michael. That was excellent. Great overview. Gail, do we have any questions for Michael before he has to depart?
Yeah, we've got 2 questions for you in the chat, both from Bill Monroe. First, are our efforts below North Fork Dam making a difference, given the potential for pre-smolts using the river and tributaries to rear? I think he means the River Basin Council's efforts, our restoration projects.
Absolutely. It's tough to kind of go down the rabbit hole on in terms of what's going on in the ocean and what's going on with climate change. And it's easy to sort of see only the negative and see the things that are daunting and that we can't change. But habitat is always a limiting factor, and we've lost so much of it. And especially in the lower river, to be able to bring some of that back is huge. And we see the importance of getting fish into healthy habitat just by looking what's going on upstream of the dam. There's so much fantastic tributary, fantastic habitat upstream in the tributaries. And, we've seen the impacts that it's had on salmonids, just to be able to quickly get them up there into that habitat. So bringing that and improving that downstream and increasing that good habitat for fish at every life stage, especially juveniles as they're out migrating. It's incredibly important. So anything we can do, every little bit does help. Again, despite how overwhelming it can seem to look at, what's going on with the ocean and fisheries in certain areas. So.
All right, and one last question for you before you go. Is the PGE gravel enhancement effort below North Fork Dam making a difference yet? I absolutely. It's kind of the same. I would give it the same answer. Everything we can do to improve habitat is going to make a difference and improve opportunities for fish spawning, especially in this case in the lower river. Admittedly, I haven't been around for a super long time to be able to watch this process all the way through, but anytime we can improve habitat, it's going to be a definite win. And we've really enjoyed seeing a lot of the work that PGE has done and sort of partnered with us to do and to promote our fisheries and to increase habitat in the lower river. I know, Tim, you're on here too. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that would definitely be what I would say.
I would agree, definitely. I think that, the things that really highlight about the River Basin Council is the 30 plus to almost 35 miles of plantings that have been going on in the lower Clackamas River. I think that's definitely something we're going to see for generations. And we're already seeing, gravel going in. We're seeing the positive impacts for habitat, spawning, things like that. So definitely we're moving in the right direction.
All right, there is one more actually. I don't know if anybody wanted to put it in the chat. Okay, somebody answered.
we have a guess as to where you were pictured fishing. And
Uh-oh.
so you can tell us if Dave Budney got it right. His guess is Middle Falls of Eagle Creek.
There you go. Yep. It's been a while, but I believe that was right. Yeah, just right near Delph Creek. That's right.
What do I get as a prize?
You'll have to come to the office and I'm sure I can. John's got all sorts of step prizes. I'm sure he would let me poach one to give to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael. Any other questions, Gail?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Come by
Look forward
anytime.
to interacting with you guys in the future.
Okay, so now we will proceed with our second presentation. So this will be more of a sit down with the Forrest and Riz show with Tim Shibahara moderating. So I think it looks like your videos you're on, your speaker is on. So you should be ready to go, Tim. So I turn it over to you three.
All right, thank you. Let me know when you see our presentation jump up.
Your screen's there, just put it in presentation mode. There it is. You're looking good.
All right, so thank you, Dave. As Dave mentioned, I'm just here to moderate. I'm not here to provide any knowledge or bias in any way, but the perspective that we're going to get from Forrest and Riz today is kind of that human connection to the watershed. Each of these characters have probably more experience on the Clackamas in their pinky than all of us combined, and so I think it's just a great opportunity to hear their perspectives on what's going on. So I'm just here to maybe just pose up some questions to kind of get us aligned on kind of what we're talking about in the Clackamas. And so first of all, tell us a little bit about your connection to the Clackamas and kind of in a nutshell, how you spent your time on the Clackamas and kind of how you fell in love with this river. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Forrest, since you're the far end of the room.
Let's see. I grew up in the area. Got my driver's license. Nobody in my family fished, so I got my driver's license and started weaning my way on to steelhead fishing. And I caught my very first steelhead out of Eagle Creek on Christmas Day, 1976, and was pretty much hooked after that. Spent almost every opportunity I could when the summer stud program got started in the upper Clackamas Basin. That was before I had boats. That was before I was a guide. And I spent every day that I possibly could in the upper basin. And I worked at a grocery store in high school, would get up in the morning and drive up and fish all the way up the upper Colwash and the upper Clackamas above Austin Hot Springs till 11 o'clock and drive home and work 1 to 10 at the grocery store. Got my first drift boat when I was 19 and started running trips in the lower Clackamas from McIver down in my drift boat in 1980. So a long history of the entire river as a bank angler and also as a boat angler.
All right, so yeah, many years there, and not a whole lot on the Clackamas since the 80s, or how? But when did?
No, I still fish Clackamas a lot, mainly in the winter months. And I don't fish the Clackamas for silvers anymore like I once did because I spend my summer and falls now in the lower Deschutes.
Okay.
And I'm also not fishing the Clackamas anymore for spring Chinooks because we no longer have an April-May fishery as we once did. So that fishery has changed.
Right. So a lot of coho, a lot of steelhead, summer steelhead back in the day when they're in the upper Clackamas.
You could fish the Clackamas 12 months out of the year and have an opportunity to be successful.
Wow.
And it was quite different. A lot more fishing activity, a lot more people at the boat ramps. Wasn't uncommon during silver season to have 15 to 25 drift boats put in at Fellheimer's and more at Barton. Today, most days in the fall, you might see 1 to 3. So it's a different time.
All right, Riz.
Well, I was raised in Oregon City and within walking distance of the Willamette and Clackamas and Abernathy Creek, which really kind of got us started because our neighborhood kids, my age, then you could go off by yourself. Fun wasn't outlawed yet. And the biggest day of the year probably for us was open day of trout season when we go down to Abernathy Creek. And of course, there'd be a bunch of fish planted in there.
Abernathy Creek.
Yeah, but we would catch cutthroat too, which would be the native fish. Well, back in the day, Department of Fish and Wildlife or the Game Commission before, they would plant trout everywhere. Rainbows, Boardman Creek, where my grandparents had a bunch of property down there, was full of rainbows every once in a while because the truck could stop on the river road and they dropped 50 fish into the pool behind the thing. And they do the same thing at Abernathy Creek here and there. Not a lot of fish, but enough to go play. And then, you know, as we got older and so forth, and we go down and fish in the Willamette with my dad and my brothers. My whole family was pretty active anglers and some of them very good. Not me. But that kind of progressed. And, you know, Clackamas was a little further and I got over there and fished off the bank some. And then I went to work for Sportcraft and I really got into it. Then, you know, I was working, I had to go to school, but I worked part-time and then I fished if there's any time left in the Willamette and in quite a bit lower into the Clackamas. Then I got just enthralled with the Clackamas as I got older and got into my teens. I bought my first, I didn't buy it, it was given to me. Drift boat, the owners of Sportcraft, they had seized a drift boat because they didn't pay for their rental. And they gave it to me. It was a real beater. It was scary to drive, and I was 15 I didn't have a trailer, put on my dad's trailer because he had moorage there all the time. And then my best friend for years, and most often fishing partner. He was exactly 1 year older than me to the day, and he had a driver's license. So we'd go up to Clackamas and throw that thing in the water and come close to half.
And was it fishy? Did you get fish?
We did get fish.
What'd you get?
Pardon?
What'd you get?
We're mostly steelhead fishing, and we did a little salmon fishing, spring Chinooks, but not that much then. We'd go down to Willamette. Willamette was good. Fish was down. But anyway, that's kind of how I got started, got the addiction, and it has not stopped. It has costed me a lot of money.
Awesome.
But it's fun.
So if the two of you could put it in a nutshell, how have things changed? Let's just say over this period of time that you started fishing, you grew up, and where we're at now. How, Forrest, how would you do it? Put it succinctly. Let's see if we can challenge you to that.
The difference is we still on paper, you look at charts, you look at graphs, you'll still see we have summer steelhead that come in from this point to this point on the graph. You still see we have spring salmon that come in at this point from this point on the graph, winter steelhead, fall silvers. The difference is back when we had year-round fisheries, we not only had these fish that entered the system, for whatever reason, a normal year for summer steelhead would have been 4,000 to 8,000 summers that would come to the trap at North Fork that would be put in the further going to the upper basin. So you had 4,000 to 8,000 summer steelhead that you not only could catch in the lower basin in February, March, April, and May, June, but then those fish would get into the upper basin and you had that fishery up there. So you had a boat fishery in the lower river, you had a bank fishery in the upper river. Winter steelhead at the time was a Thanksgiving kind of a start date all the way through February, March. Nowadays, our winter steelhead fishery is a February, March fishery. spring Chinook were, it was not uncommon to have somebody catch some in February in the lower Clackamas. I know myself, I boated several over the years in February, and you'd have those fish from February till late May, early June, depending on water conditions. So the angling opportunity to be successful was much, the window was much wider than the window is today. You can still have a successful day on the Clackamas River fishing for some species of fish, not all of them, but the window was much wider in my earlier career on the Clackamas.
And so what we're saying is just that abundance has probably not changed dramatically. I mean, maybe now that we did have some low years for it, but the opportunity definitely compressed. Spring Chinook, not as much opportunity to really get into them. Steelhead, not as much, especially with summer steelhead being gone. Coho, I don't know.
Yes, we went from a river that you had an opportunity to be successful 12 months out of the year to a river that's vastly different today as far as your angling opportunity. I worked at Larry's Sporting Goods in the late 70s, and I'll never forget, people would come into the store that had no fishing experience whatsoever. You could sell them an inexpensive Eagle Claw rod or Mitchell 300 reel, sell them some corkies, some pencil lead, give them kind of an overview of what they need to do. And within a week, that guy would come back and tell you, thank you, you caught a fish. Those are stories that you don't get to hear as much anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Riz, why don't you go ahead and correct for us on all the things that he's wrong about?
He's wrong on several points. Well, one of the things I want to mention when we're talking about the Clackamas River, and people have to understand what the Clackamas River's gone through since the late 1800s. It's amazing there are any fish in this river for a lot of reasons. There were gill netters, there was dam at Cross Park for a long time. The early hatchery operations were here strictly to provide salmon for the gill net fishery. They took every fish they could possibly get their hands on, millions and millions of eggs raised when they were lucky, raised to fry age and released directly in the river. The upshot was they didn't get that many fish back, but they killed a hell of a lot of the fish in the Clackamas River to get the eggs. And to the point where they couldn't get them out of the Clackamas even. They had collecting stations in the upper Clackamas. The one everybody knows about was at Carver. But they
were doing that like in the late 1800s.
Yes,
when they started. The Clackamas was one of the first rivers where they started harvesting. We had commercial gillnet fisheries on the Clackamas River.
Yeah, and it was back in the day when they were trying to supplement the Columbia River and Willamette and Clackamas for commercial fisheries. It was a federal operation. They were sent here just for that purpose. And there was no regard. There were weirs, there were dams. They took every fish they could get their hands on. And when they no longer could get eggs out of Clackamas River fish, they would import them from all over the place. They'd bring eggs in, buy them in some cases, and once again, release them as fry. As soon as they could see that they're free swimming and could eat, they'd turn them loose into the river. Well, that didn't work out so good. So,
and I mean, we also had dam fish ladder failures on the dams up here from like 1917 to 1935. And so we had periods where we had no salmon in the upper Clackamas. So I think that's important what you're bringing up.
Yeah. Well, and all kinds of things went in the river. There's gravel mining in the river. There's gravel mining in the river for the first, I don't know, 7 or 8 years that I was fishing on the river. There isn't anymore. They moved them off the river. But they did that at, it was a big deal was when they did the pond behind the gravel mine behind the shopping center in the city. They had to dig a channel up to Clackamas to get access in there. And then Erickson's Eddy, I know these places don't mean anything to anybody, but they mined out of the river originally there. There was one in Carver that was really fun. It was a line with a bucket on it on the south side. You can still see the
You can still
shack
see
in the
the
road there.
concrete in the shack.
And a guy had a whistle, and you come down there in your drift boat, you'd hold up in the hole above there. And when the guy was the deal was, when he saw you, he wouldn't toot. He toot the horn when he dropped the bucket on the cable. And his favorite thing was when he dropped in with your drift boat and were committed and you couldn't come back, he'd toot the horn. And you could hear that thing start rattling down that cable. Well, he knew full well it wasn't gonna hit you, but it made you go downstream all day.
Right.
But
overall, there's been a lot of impacts, right? There's been a lot,
huge.
and it is pretty amazing that the Clackamas is where it's at today.
But when I was younger and in my 20s and beyond, there was a lot more activity on the Clackamas too, fishing. There was a lot of bank fishing that went on. Used to be that at Clackamas Park in Oregon City, the road that's now blocked off that runs from about where the boat ramp is now down to the mouth was a wide area, and it was chock-a-block with cars, and they were all plunking bank fishermen. And they'd sit in there in their cars, and they caught quite a few fish. It was Cross Park, where when I would get off work, when I worked the graveyard shift, I'd go home, I'd always stop at Cross Park during steelhead season and see how they were doing. I'm gonna talk to guys and try to find somebody to give me a cup of coffee, and it was good. I go home, I live in Gladstone, I go home and grip my stuff and go back and fish with them. High rocks, especially during Chinook season, was just like chock-a-block with people. It was outstanding fishing in there. And there was more opportunity. There was a lot of opportunity across from where I live now at the Grants Park area, up above halfway between Barton and Carver.
And I guess I'll interrupt you, but Forrest, from your perspective, bringing up like what Riz is talking about here, about the change in demographics, the change in people out there. I mean, we've talked about this. We don't see kids out there, grabbing the fishing poles and running to the river anymore, but we see a lot of people on the river. I mean, I don't think you can take a boat up and down this river just about any sunny day on the Clackamas River, just about, for fear of conflict with some of the floating device. And so what do you think about that? What do you think about the change in demographics and the loss of the fishing opportunity?
In Oregon City, when I was a kid, there were 3 or 4 drugstores in town. All of them had tackle. Frederick's Hardware had a tackle shop. Estes' Hardware had a tackle shop. Hops Upholstery had a tackle shop. Of course, there were no big box stores then. And everybody fished. The mayor fished. I mean, the city, and I'm being too critical of Oregon City, but it's quite gentrified now. And it's grown a lot. So the mayor fished, the council fished, Supreme Court justice fished, in probably the worst bunch of outlaws that were on the river in a particular place. But I mean, everybody fished.
In trying to answer Tim's question, I think I'll just use the month of June as an example. There would have been a lot of conflict if there would have been the rafting floating pressure there is today back in those days, because it was a fishing river. And I think you probably would have not seen the rafting stuff last, because I think the conflict would have been, hey, this is a fishing river, and we're trying to fish these holes, and you can't, and so there certainly wasn't, when I was in high school, I mentioned this, you could float the river. If you did choose to raft it in July or August, most days you wouldn't see anybody else back when I was in high school, because it wasn't the thing to do. So very different in the use. That's
Well, about the time I moved to the river is when it changed. I mean, there were some rafters, and we rafted a lot. We hardly ever go now. But it became well known as a party river. And so the people came from all over instead of local folks, just local folks. And it turned into a real bad deal. it's improved.
Yeah.
It has improved.
And so let's go ahead and start shifting gears a little bit here. And what are some of the things that you see for the future of the Clackamas River? What do you think is the direction that we're going with our fisheries? What gives you, I mean, go ahead and share, what makes you worry, but go ahead and share what you think is going right as well.
What I think is going right is the effort in habitat. It's in my opinion, the river is much healthier today than it was 40 or 50 years ago. We've made, I should say, PG has made a lot of changes in how they operate the dams. They've got, out migration, in migration stuff going on that's way better. The negative, in my opinion, is that we continue to want to eliminate angling opportunity in how we're operating from a hatchery standpoint. And I think that there's room to have both, especially on the Clackamas River. And I would love to be able to see some means, and we're seeing little glimpses of it with the broodstock program for the steelhead. We're seeing, an uptick in the potential with the broodstock program for spring Chinook. The silver return, the early silver return in the upper basin was strong, although sometimes it doesn't always equate out to a strong fishery. So it would be really interesting to see if we can incorporate some stronger hatchery influence along with continuing with what we're doing with the wild component.
Any thoughts on that, Rose?
Well, I agree. PGE's done a great job. And there's some good things and bad things about creating a wild fish sanctuary above the dams. One, for example, it used to be a trout fishery. And it was a family trout fishery. It was a bank trout fishery. The campgrounds were loaded. People just flocked to the area. And this has to do with recruitment. This is a kind of situation where you get people started at fishing and hopefully they carry it on. And he and I both enjoyed that upper river. Even when I lived on one of the better steelhead holes, summer steelhead holes in the Clackamas for a fly rodder, I would get up probably at least once every 2 weeks, and I'd drive up above Austin and start fishing up there, because it was really a unique small stream kind of experience. And I'd sure like to see somebody figure out the biology doing that. Like you and I talked about the other day. When you look at the Clackamas, there was no biology involved or no science involved when they started planting, or not planting, but running hatcheries on the river. But in the last few years, science has grown enormously, and it's like an exponential growth. And I think in the next few years, there's going to be ways that can make some of these really good, don't have to have a $60,000 boat to do it, fisheries left in the Clackamas. For example, getting the summer steelhead somewhere or another back into the upper Clackamas.
I would agree.
Yeah.
We've done a horrible job of recognizing opportunities that we once had and allowing the opportunities to continue to go away. It's sad to me to see, especially the bank angler as an example, whether it's up in the upper Clackamas or whether it's on Eagle Creek. We've lost so many opportunities for people. And maybe guys like Riz and myself are too old and we need to go away. But for the people that aren't aware of what we did have at one time, growing up as a kid, I did not know there were other rivers. That's how good the Clackamas was.
Yeah.
And it would be great to see some of that opportunity come back to where it's not just strictly that guy that has that $60,000 boat that can go catch a fish. The guy that maybe can fish once a month, maybe he has an opportunity to catch a fish. That's not done on a 200 fish return. It doesn't happen.
All right, so any closing thoughts? I think that we're getting close to our time here, so I'll just go ahead and give you guys each one last bout on the soapbox here about anything that you wanted to just add it to your knowledge about the fisheries.
Well, one is we don't talk, not, we're talking about steelhead and salmon primarily. This used to be a great sea run cutthroat river. It's a native fish to the Clackamas, and it was one of them. And there are still remnants of that left, but there's nobody doing anything about it. There's fall Chinook in the Clackamas, mostly were tulies. They tried to introduce, I think, kellet stock, was it kellet stocks and brighter fish for a while, but you couldn't fish for them because they were trying to. That failed. There just has to be a lot of opportunity if you want to recruit people to be anglers as they grow older. I commend PGE for the work you've done here on the river. I think it's extraordinary. The outcome is extraordinary. I think ODFW, who's a little more constrained than PGE is in terms of finances and so forth, is doing a good job, and particularly with the new water source for the hatchery at McIver and the ability to keep fish there instead of having their suitcase packed all the time so they can go to Bonneville or Oak Springs or wherever they're going to go and just live here in the river that they're born in.
I think the progressive HGMP plan,
Yep.
hatchery genetic management plan.
Yep. I think they're, and now we're going to do well brood stock on the Chinook. I agree with you. This creates, a more robust fish.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. When the winter steelhead went to a mix with wild fish, the fish were more robust. They looked more robust, and they were biters. And it was a good deal. One of the main things is we've got to do the kinds of things, if you want to have any support for the fisheries, is to recruit new anglers, because we're not getting them now. And probably the average age is mine, ancient. So
Forrest?
The group that is on this tonight, and maybe it won't be, again, I'm not a computer guy, but I would be really interested to know how many of the folks that listened in on this tonight have ever caught a salmon or still on the Clackamas.
Cool. There's something to put in the chat there.
Great idea, Tim. You can have
Yeah.
folks, if you're interested, just type in chat whether you caught a salmon or a steelhead.
Yeah.
And if you want to catch one, call Riz.
So Forrest, did you have any wrap up?
I appreciate you guys letting us have your ear. Thank you.
Well, thank
All right,
you,
Dave.
Tim.
Dave, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you. I hope that all worked for you all. Thank you for giving Riz and Forrest some time here, and I really appreciate them for coming in and sharing all their experience on the river with us.
I really thank you, all three of you, Tim, Forrest, and Riz, for those historical and philosophical excursions. That's a nice mix up that we've got now, compared to a traditional presentation. That was marvelous.
Thanks.
So,
I have to buy them a lot of beer for all their comments about PGE though, so that's going to
I
cost.
thought
them.
there was a quid pro quo, to use an overused term here. Yeah, okay. So Gail, do we have any questions for any of our three speakers here?
We have just one question, and they kind of answered it during the chat already, but I'll say it. Maybe they've got something to add. The question is, do you both have some optimism about PGE's help with McIver Hatchery and the effort to move to spring Chinook broodstock? And it seems we did hear some positive comments from Riz on that, but if you've got anything to add.
The only thing that I will add is, yes, it's the optimism is strong. The only thing I would add, for it to be a positive from a fishery standpoint, somehow, some way, we need to get somehow fish to come back in April and May when we have water conditions, which is what we used to have, was a fishery in April and May. from a fishery standpoint, having those fish come back in April and May is really important.
And I'd like to say one thing too. You know, when I was talking about the condition of the Clackamas and the historic perspective of that, these guys could do all they possibly can, PGE, ODFW, if everything works out perfectly. The fact is, they're not in control of some of the major factors that affect these fish runs. For example, ocean conditions, and not just ocean conditions, but the abuse of the biomass of the ocean by catching Alaska, Gulf of Alaska, and things like that. And there's no way that these guys can solve that problem. I mean, they can participate in solving the bycatch and so forth, but we're having worldwide meetings about global warming. And if that doesn't work, you can just kiss this all goodbye.
Is that it, Gail?
Those are all the questions. I didn't know if you would want to read the responses to the fishing question. We got a bunch of responses.
Oh, why don't you can you summarize?
I think we have about 5 or 6 people who say yes, they have caught a salmon or steelhead in the Clackamas. Sam Brown has caught both, Bill Monroe, Ian Ferguson, let's see, Stephen Rice has caught steelhead in Coho, and Richard Christ. And then a couple people maybe have caught those fish charter fishing on the ocean, but not on the Clackamas. And someone has tried, but not succeeded.
Gotta
Okay.
get these people some cards.
Well, that's marvelous. And
Sounds like Forrest and Riz had their work cut out for them, huh? They need to get everybody out there fishing.
yeah, that would be good. Okay, so just before folks get off tonight, I just want to make a special announcement for our next session. And this really applies to you too, Rob Guttridge. So listen closely. Our next session will be November 30th. So we're going to be continuing our series focusing on water and fish. And this time we will be talking, we're building up our learning curve here on the fishery. So we'll be talking about habitat capacity. So that was alluded to a little bit earlier on. We're going to drill into that a little bit more and restoration potential within our basin. But please note that this webinar will begin at 2 p.m. on November 30th, not 6 p.m. So please mark your calendars accordingly. This will be one of those little bit more drilling into the details seminar that we have in the afternoon for professionals, but certainly everybody is encouraged to attend. You'll still get quite a bit out of it. So again, November 30th at 2 p.m. will be our next one. And you can use the same Zoom link that you've used in the past to log on. And we'll send you a thank you email with these links, as well as a link to the recording for more information about continuing education units from Clackamas Community College. Again, our thanks to Michael, Riz, and Forrest for tonight's wonderful talks. That was great, a good variety of information there. We also like to thank our gold sponsors, Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas Water Environment Services, and our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers, Metro, Port Blakely, and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. We're hoping to keep this conference free for everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight. And please let us know what you thought of the program. And we'll see you two Tuesdays from now on November 30th. So thank you again, everybody.